In ancient times in the vast empire of Persia, when kings ruled with absolute power and the people lived in cycles of favor, intrigue, oppression and cries for deliverance, it was a turbulent period marked by instability and hidden threats. The ancient records of Esther tell us in the days of King Xerxes, who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces, the Jews lived scattered among the nations, facing the constant risk of being forgotten or destroyed. In the midst of this chaos, we find Esther, an apparently ordinary young Jewish orphan, but destined for an extraordinary mission. Imagine the scene: Esther, a young woman raised by her cousin Mordecai, in the city of Susa, quietly going about her daily life, completely unaware that the fate of her entire people would soon rest on her shoulders. It was in this moment of apparent insignificance that the improbable happened. The king's officials were searching for a new queen after Queen Vashti had been deposed. Esther 2:7 presents the scene. Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he had brought up because she had neither father nor mother. This young woman, who was also known as Esther, had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter. Esther must have looked around, thinking the officials were looking for someone else. Her response reveals her humility and hesitation. How could a Jewish orphan possibly be chosen for the king's palace? Yet the king's decree did not come to debate social status, it came with a mission. Esther 2:8 continues: when the king's order and edict had been proclaimed, many young women were brought to the harem at the citadel of Susa, and Esther also was taken to the king's palace. Esther, still in disbelief, tries to hide her identity. She sees herself as the least in her people, which in turn is the least in the empire. How could she be the chosen one for such a grand and dangerous role? Esther 2:10 shows us Esther had not revealed her nationality and family background because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. The king's promise is clear and powerful. It doesn't depend on Esther's royal blood, but on the hidden hand of God himself. Still hesitant, Esther asks for guidance. She prepares herself with oils and beauty treatments. The eunuch Hegai then performs something extraordinary. Esther 2:15 tells us when the turn came for Esther to go to the king, she asked for nothing except what Hegai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the harem, suggested. At that moment, the reality of divine favor hit Esther with full force. The text tells us in Esther 2:17 the king was attracted to Esther more than to any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. The improbable calling was sealed. Esther, the least of the least, had been chosen by God for a mission that would change the course of her people's history. Her journey of transformation from a fearful orphan hiding her identity to a fearless queen who would risk everything was just beginning. Esther built a quiet trust in the hidden hand of God there and called it the Lord is with us. That place in Susa, which had once been a symbol of exile and danger, became a memorial of the transformative encounter between a powerful God and an ordinary woman. The call of God to Esther was clear, but the young queen still struggled with her insecurities. Although she had been crowned, Queen Esther needed more assurances before risking her life for her people. The narrative continues in Esther 4:13-14, where we read Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, "Do not think that because you are in the king's house you alone of all the Jews will escape, for if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this?" This request from Esther reveals her persistent hesitation. She sought a tangible sign, something she could see untouched, to confirm God's will. It reflects human nature, which often seeks concrete evidence, even in the face of divine promises. What happened next was extraordinary. Esther 4:15-16 tells us, "Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai, Go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa, and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." Imagine the scene: Esther sending the message, her heart racing as she prepared for 3 days of fasting. The ground around her was filled with the prayers of her people, an undeniable moment of collective faith. But the story doesn't end there. Esther, still not entirely convinced, makes an even bolder request. She decides to approach the king uninvited, knowing the law could mean death. This request defies the laws of the palace, since no one could enter the king's presence without being called. The fact that God granted her favor demonstrates his patience and understanding of Esther's doubts. It serves as a powerful reminder that God often accommodates our weaknesses, providing the assurance we need to fulfill His will. These events hold profound significance. The fasting, a product of desperation, could symbolize the people of Israel, the scattered flock of God. In the first test, the fasting being observed while the palace remained indifferent could represent how God would bless His people in a hostile world. In the second test, Esther approaching the king while the law remained strict could symbolize how God would use one woman to bless the nations around them. More than that, these tests illustrate Esther's gradual transformation from a woman hiding her identity in the palace. She was now in direct conversation with destiny, negotiating the terms of her faith and courage. It is important to note that although God answered Esther's request, seeking signs is not the ideal standard of faith. In many other passages of Scripture, we are encouraged to trust in God's word without demanding miraculous proof. However, at this crucial moment in Israel's history, God in His grace chose to strengthen Esther's faith through these tangible moments of favor. The approach to the king marks a turning point in Esther's narrative. Her doubts were dissipated, her courage strengthened. She was now ready to stand before the king for her people. The woman who once considered herself the least in her family was about to become one of the greatest deliverers of Israel. The story of Esther's courage teaches us several important lessons. First, that God is patient with our doubts and is willing to provide us with the assurance we need to fulfill His will. Second, that faith often grows gradually through concrete experiences with God. And third, that when God calls us to a task, He also equips us with the courage needed to accomplish it. As the 3 days of fasting ended under the rising sun, Esther rose as a new woman. Her insecurities had been washed away along with the fast, and in their place grew fierce determination. The queen that God had seen from the beginning was finally emerging with divine confirmation secured. Esther was ready for the next step in her journey. The banquet needed to be prepared, and a decisive confrontation was on the horizon. The woman who tested destiny with fasting was about to be tested in the heat of royal intrigue with renewed courage. From the moments of favor, Esther was ready to stand before the king. God's call echoed in her ears, and the time to act had come. The narrative transports us to a crucial moment in the history of the Jews where human caution would be challenged by divine timing. Esther 5:1 sets the scene. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall facing the entrance. Esther, now also known as Queen Esther, had prepared herself with prayer and fasting and approached the king with a considerable risk. The ancient records give us an idea of the magnitude of this moment in Esther 5:2. When he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her and held out to her the gold scepter that was in his hand. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. The king's response to this bold approach was surprising. The same verse continues, "Then the king asked, 'What is your request, Queen Esther?' 'It will be given you. What is your petition?' It will also be granted, even up to half the kingdom." Imagine the scene, more than the entire court holding its breath. As Esther stood before the throne, the king's unexpected favor left only 1/3 of the expected danger. For a queen, risking her life by entering uninvited would be devastating, but God had different plans. Instead of lamenting the risk, the king surprises Esther with a shocking offer. Instead of refusing the audience, the Lord surprises her with favor. This divine instruction challenges all court logic. Haman and his plot were a formidable force. Esther 3:8 describes Haman the Agagite had been elevated to the highest position in the empire. He had issued a decree to destroy all the Jews in one day. Faced with such a vast threat, the common strategy would be to gather as many allies as possible. But God had other plans. Obediently Esther invites the king and Haman to a banquet. What happens next is a divine selection based on an unusual criterion. Esther 5. For 5 tells us, if it pleases the king, replied Esther, let the king together with Haman come today to a banquet I have prepared for him. So the king and Haman went to the banquet Esther had prepared. The king said to Esther, what is your petition, Queen Esther? It will be given you. What is your request? It will also be granted, even up to half the kingdom. The Lord said to Esther, with this invitation I will begin to turn the heart of the king. Let Haman go home. This peculiar test drastically shifted the power from Haman to Esther, a shift of more than 99% in influence. To put this in perspective, imagine a royal court where the most powerful advisor is suddenly invited to a private banquet. Human logic would scream that this is madness, a political defeat, but God's ways are not our ways, and his thoughts are not our thoughts. This drastic shift had a clear purpose expressed in Esther 5. 9. Haman went out that day happy and in high spirits, but when he saw Mordecai at the king's gate and observed that he neither rose nor showed fear in his presence, he was filled with rage against Mordecai. God was teaching a powerful lesson not only to Esther, but to the entire Jewish people and to all future generations. Deliverance would not come through royal favor or political skill, but through the hidden hand of God. This truth would echo through the centuries, finding its fullest expression in the New Testament, where the Apostle Paul writes into Corinthians 12. 9. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. The selection of the banquet, based on Esther's invitation, may seem ordinary at first glance, but it may have a deeper meaning. Those who waited patiently, like Esther, remaining alert and vigilant, could represent the most prepared and faithful. The quality would be crucial in the confrontation to come. Moreover, the number of banquets has significance in biblical history. It was with 2 banquets that Esther turned the king's heart. It was also with 2 banquets that the plot against the Jews was exposed. God was once again demonstrating that he can accomplish great deeds with small, courageous acts. Imagine the mixed feelings in the Jewish community that night. Thousands of Jews fasting and praying, perhaps relieved to have a queen, but also afraid for the seemingly impossible task ahead. As for Esther, this was the ultimate test of her newly strengthened faith. She had asked God for favor with the king, and God had answered. Now God was asking Esther for a sign of her trust, standing before the king with a tiny plan against a formidable enemy. The invitation of the king teaches us profound lessons about faith, trust, and the power of God. It reminds us that God does not need large armies or abundant resources to accomplish his purposes. He often chooses to work through the small, the weak, and the improbable to demonstrate his power and receive all the glory. This story also challenges us to trust in God, even when circumstances seem impossible. How many times do we feel inadequate or ill-equipped for the tasks God places before us? Esther's story reminds us that it is precisely in those moments that God can operate most powerfully. As the banquet was prepared, the atmosphere of expectation hung over the palace. They knew they were about to witness something extraordinary. The God who had shifted the king's heart certainly had a plan for deliverance. Night fell over the royal palace. In the distance, the lamps of Haman's house flickered, reminding Esther and Mordecai of the seemingly impossible task before them. But with God, the impossible was about to become possible. Israel's greatest deliverance was about to begin, not with the roar of armies, but with the quiet courage of one woman. With only a banquet against an empire-wide decree, Esther faced an apparent impossible situation, but God in his infinite wisdom had an extraordinary plan to ensure the Jews' victory. The night before the second banquet was crucial. God, recognizing Esther's natural apprehension, offered her a unique opportunity to strengthen her faith. Esther 6:1-3 states that night the king could not sleep, so he ordered the book of the Chronicles, the record of his reign, to be brought in and read to him. It was found recorded there that Mordecai had exposed Bigthani and Tears, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, who had conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. The king said, "What honor and recognition has Mordecai received for this?" The king's servants answered, "Nothing has been done for him." This divine instruction action reveals both God's understanding of human weaknesses and his willingness to strengthen his servants obediently. The king ordered Haman to honor Mordecai. What happened next was nothing short of providential. Esther 6:10-11 describes the scene. The king commanded Haman, "So go at once, take the robes and the horse, and do just as you have suggested for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything you have recommended." So Haman took the robes and the horse, and he robed Mordecai, and led him on horseback through the city streets, proclaiming before him, "This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor." This honor and its interpretation were exactly what Esther needed to hear. The royal robe, a common symbol of favor, represented Esther's unlikely position. The public proclamation symbolized the imminent defeat of Haman. God was showing Esther that even the enemy was unconsciously recognizing the divine power acting through her. Strengthened by this experience, Esther prepared for the second banquet, ready to reveal the plot. Esther 7:1-3 tells us, "So the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet, and as they were drinking wine, on the second day the king again asked, 'What is your petition, Queen Esther?' 'It will be given you. What is your request?' 'It will also be granted, even up to half the kingdom.' Then Queen Esther answered, 'If I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases your majesty, grant me my life. This is my petition and the lives of my people. This is my request.'" The strategy was simple yet brilliant in its psychological effectiveness. The plan was to create the illusion of a loyal queen while revealing the plot, taking advantage of the private setting and the element of surprise. Esther 7:6 records, Esther said, "The adversary and enemy is this vile Haman." Then Haman was terrified before the king and queen. The effect was immediate and devastating. Esther 7:7-8 reports, "The king got up in a rage, left his wine, and went out into the palace garden. But Haman, realizing that the king had already decided his fate, stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life." Just as the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was reclining. The king exclaimed, "Will he even molest the queen while she is with me in the palace?" The confusion in the royal court was total. The sudden revelation, the king's rage and Haman's desperate plea created the illusion of justice being served from all sides. In their panic, the king ordered Haman's execution on the very gallows he had prepared for Mordecai. This divine strategy demonstrates several important truths. First, it shows that God often uses unusual methods to achieve his purposes. The weapons of victory were not armies or decrees, but banquets, courage, and timing. Second, it highlights the importance of obedience. Esther and Mordecai followed God's instructions to the letter even when they seemed risky or illogical. Their faithfulness was rewarded with a miraculous deliverance. Third, it illustrates the power of faith in action. Esther had to believe that the plan would work, exposing herself to danger by revealing the plot at the right moment. Finally, it demonstrates that when God is in control, even the smallest forces can overcome the greatest threats. The victory did not come through Esther's royal position, but through the hidden hand of God working through her obedient heart. As Haman was led away in chains, Esther and Mordecai remained in the palace witnessing the incredible divine intervention. The battle was won, but the decree against the Jews still stood. The people which had watched from afar would now join the defense, completing the victory that God had so miraculously initiated. Esther, now fully confident in the power of God, led an unrelenting effort to reverse the decree. This phase of the campaign would reveal not only Esther's determination but also the internal challenges that the Jews would face even amidst victory. Esther 8:3 shows us how the reversal began. Esther again pleaded with the king, falling at his feet and weeping. She begged him to put an end to the evil plan of Haman, the Agagite, which he had devised against the Jews. The king extended the gold scepter to Esther, and she arose and stood before him. Esther's strategy proved effective. Esther 8:7-8 records, the king said to Queen Esther and Mordecai the Jew, "Because Haman attacked the Jews, I have given his estate to Esther, and they have impaled him on the pole he had set up Now write another decree in the king's name in behalf of the Jews as seems best to you, and seal it with the king's signet ring, for no document written in the king's name and seal with his ring can be revoked. This call demonstrates Esther's strategic leadership. She not only reversed the decree, but also mobilized the Jews to defend themselves. The response was immediate, as we see in Esther 8. 15:16. The Jews had light and gladness, joy and honor in every city and province to which the edict of the king came. The Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and a holiday. Esther's strategy proved effective. The Jews captured the plotters and defended their families. Esther 9:1-2 reports, on the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, the edict commanded by the king was to be carried out. The enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, but now the tables were turned and the Jews got the upper hand over those who hated them. The Jews assembled in their cities in all the provinces to attack those determined to destroy them. No one could stand against them because the people of all the other nationalities were afraid of them. The capture and defeat of the enemies was a significant blow against the threat. However, this victory also brought to light internal tensions among the Jews. Esther 9:15-16 records, the Jews in Susa came together on the 14th day of the month of Adar, and they put to death in Susa 300 men, but they did not lay their hands on the plunder. The rest of the Jews who were in the royal provinces also assembled to protect themselves and get relief from their enemies. They killed 75,000 of them, but they did not lay their hands on the plunder. These actions of Esther, although they may seem severe by modern standards, demonstrate the fulfillment of her word and establish her authority as queen. They also serve as a warning against a lack of solidarity and support in times of national crisis. Despite these setbacks, Esther and Mordecai persisted in their effort. Esther 9:20 gives us the outcome of this defense. Mordecai recorded these events, and he sent letters to all the Jews throughout the provinces of King Xerxes, near and far, to establish the regular observance of the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar as days of joy and feasting, as a holiday when the Jews got relief from their enemies and their sorrow was turned into joy and their mourning into a day of celebration. He wrote them to observe the days as days of feasting and joy and giving presents of food to one another and gifts to the poor. The establishment of Purim marked the effective end of the threat. However, Esther still had accounts to settle with those who had opposed her people. Esther 9:29 Tito describes how she fulfilled her promise. Esther the queen, the daughter of Abihail, wrote with full authority to confirm this second letter about Purim, and Mordecai sent letters to all the Jews in the 127 provinces of Xerxes' kingdom, words of goodwill and assurance to confirm these days of Purim at their designated times, as they were observed as prescribed in the time of Mordecai and Esther, and as they had established for themselves and their descendants in regard to their times of fasting and lamentation. These actions of Esther, although they may seem ordinary, demonstrate the fulfillment of her word and establish her legacy as queen. They also serve as a warning against forgetting the deliverance in times of peace. Finally, Esther confronted the memory of the threat. Esther 10:1-3 recounts this final episode. King Xerxes imposed tribute throughout the empire to its distant shores, and all his acts of power and might, together with a full account of the greatness of Mordecai to which the king had raised him, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Media and Persia? Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Xerxes, preeminent among the Jews and held in high esteem by his many fellow Jews because he worked for the good of his people and spoke up for the welfare of all the Jews. This final episode of the deliverance reveals several aspects of Esther's character. Her determination to remember the deliverance shows her sense of justice and communal loyalty. The establishment of Purim and Esther's subsequent action demonstrate her strength and resolve as queen. With the institution of Purim, Esther's campaign came to an end. The Jews were free from their threat, and Esther emerged as a powerful and respected queen. However, the consequences of this victory and Esther's subsequent decisions would have a lasting impact on the history of the Jews, as we will see in the legacy of Purim. After the decisive victory over Haman, Esther found herself herself in a position of great respect and authority in Persia. Her legacy, however, would be marked by a mix of triumph and warning. Faithfulness and remembrance. The people, impressed with her courage, made a surprising observance. Esther 9:28 states these days should be remembered and observed throughout every generation by every family and in every province and in every city. And these days of Purim should never fail to be celebrated by the Jews, nor should the memory of these days die out among their descendants. This observance reflected the people's desire for annual remembrance, foreshadowing the future festivals of the Jewish people. However, Esther's response demonstrated her understanding of the true source of deliverance. Esther 9:27 records the Jews took it on themselves to establish the custom that they and their descendants and all who join them should without fail observe these 2 days every year in the way prescribed and at the time appointed. This declaration by Esther was a powerful testimony of her faith and understanding of God's role as the true deliverer of her people. She recognized that her victory was not the result of her own beauty or skill but of God's hidden hand. However, Esther's subsequent actions revealed a complexity in her character. Esther 10:3 narrates an intriguing episode and all his acts of power and might, together with a full account of the greatness of Mordecai to which the king had raised him. Are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Media and Persia? Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Xerxes, preeminent among the Jews and held in high esteem by his many fellow Jews because he worked for the good of his people and spoke up for the welfare of all the Jews. This description of Esther's family, particularly the mention of Mordecai's position, suggests that she may have adopted practices more associated with royal influence than with a simple Jewish woman. The specific mention of Mordecai is significant, for he would come to play a continuing role in the subsequent history of the Jews. The end of Esther's recorded life is summarized in the tradition. Esther lived to see the establishment of Purim and was remembered as the queen who risked everything for her people. Tragically, after Esther's time, the people occasionally turned away from the lessons of Purim. The ancient records tell us no sooner had the generation passed than some Jews again faced new threats and forgot the unity that had saved them. They failed to show loyalty to the memory of Esther for all the good things she had done for them. This return to division and lack of gratitude toward Esther's legacy demonstrates the cyclical nature of the Jewish history. During the time of exile, periods of faithfulness and blessing were often followed by spiritual decline and turmoil. The story of Esther is a powerful testimony to God's ability to use unlikely people to fulfill his purposes. From her calling as an ordinary orphan to becoming a powerful queen, Esther exemplifies how faith and courage can overcome fear and insignificance. Esther's life challenges us to trust in God even when circumstances seem impossible. It reminds us that God can do much with little when we place our trust in him. As we reflect on this story, let us ask ourselves, where in our lives might God be calling us to act in courage? What decrees of difficulty do we face that seem insurmountable? How can we, like Esther, move forward in obedience, trusting not in our own position but in God's hidden hand? The story of Esther remains relevant today, reminding us that God is still in the business of transforming ordinary people into extraordinary instruments of his will. May we, like Esther, respond to God's call with faith and courage, ready to be used by him in ways we may never have imagined possible. If this story touched your heart and you wish to learn more about the heroes of faith in the Bible, be sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Together we can explore the rich lessons that Scripture has to teach and apply them to our daily lives.